Did you just read a poem and wish you understood it a little better? Is everybody talking about the poem you just read, but you don't even know what's going on? Well, that's okay. Don't worry about it. I'm going to teach you how to read a poem in 3 easy steps. When I was your age, I really didn't understand poetry. In fact, I'm sad to tell you that I probably didn't really understand poetry until my mid-30s. It saddens me to think about all the years I spent alone when I could have been with poetry. And I don't want this to happen to you. That's one of the reasons I'm making this video for you today. I think if you watch this video and understand these basic steps, you'll be on your way to understanding poetry right now. So, what is a poem? And how is a poem different from prose? Well, in prose, the basic unit is probably called a sentence. In poetry, the basic unit is a line. A line can be a lot of things. It can be as long as the poet wants it to be. One line might rhyme with another line at the end, but it doesn't have to. All the lines in a poem might have the same rhyme and rhythm, but they might not. The lines of a poem might end with a period, but they might not. In fact, some poems might not have any periods until the very end, or none at all. Because of the demands of rhyme, rhythm, and structure, meaning often becomes compact, which means the poets need to use precise language to communicate within their rhyme and rhythm schemes. Vocabulary words might get hard. Figurative and symbolic language might predominate. Poetry, just like prose, is often persuasive. Poems have themes and messages, just like prose, but the way that they persuade is often more emotional. But regardless of what type of poem you're dealing with, you have to get through the complex language, structure, vocabulary, and figurative language to understand what's going on in the poem before you even start to think about thematic concepts and messages. Today we're going to learn to read poetry through Alice Dunbar's 1918 poem, I Sit and Sew. The first thing I do when I approach a poem is that I think about the title and I think about the speaker and the historical context. This poem's title, I Sit and Sew, tells me it's probably going to be from the perspective of a single speaker. And I know that it's probable that this poet is sitting and sewing. This might not seem to convey much to you. Think about it for a second. If somebody is sitting, it means their freedoms and their liberties are limited. And when I think about sitting and sewing, that sounds pretty boring. It doesn't sound super desirable. Even though sewing is something that is extremely important, it's something that is often not valued and not appreciated in our society. In terms of historical context, there's 2 ideas that come to mind for me as soon as I think about 1918. I think of a woman. Here in the 21st century, that might not seem fair, but in 1918, it's kind of fair because this was a standard role assigned to women. When I think about 1918, I think about the limited roles of women in society. I think about the way women didn't even get the right to vote until 1919, but the ways that their lives were very restricted in society, even after that. So I'm thinking that it's possible that feminism is a theme in the limited roles of women. I also think about World War I. World War I ended in 1918. It was by far the greatest war that the United States fought in since the Civil War. About 4 million Americans journeyed to Europe and fought in World War I, and over 100,000 died. This war was filled with carnage like the world had never seen, and the war also took on great national importance. So when I'm reading this poem, I'm going to think about the roles of women, and I'm going to think about World War I. The next step is to read the poem and comprehend it. By comprehension, I'm just talking about understanding what happens in the poem and what all the words and lines mean. I'm not talking about deeper thematic importance yet. And when you read the poem, it's a good idea to annotate the poem as you go along. You should annotate for difficult vocabulary, for syntactical inversions, which are parts of the poem where words get mixed up and don't follow normal sentence structures. And you should also note the differences between figurative and literal language. Once you annotate the poem, you should go back and look up the meanings of all the words that you didn't understand, make sure you understand the sentences where the syntactical inversions happen, and finally, make sure you understand the figurative language and what it means. If you do this, you can paraphrase the poem in your own words, and you can totally understand what's happening in the poem. I'm going to give you a second now to go ahead and read I Sit and Sew. You should probably pause this video. I'll give you a little reading music though, in case you want to keep it going. Do, 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 do. All right, that got a little silly. Let's annotate this poem. Just to give an example, I'm going to read and annotate this for you, and you can follow along on my screen and compare it to what you did. First, let's look for difficult vocabulary. And I'm just going to underline some words that you might not know the meanings of. I think you know the meanings of most of these words, but there's a few of them that you might not, and they're going to be important. Here, I've just underlined panoply and roseate, even though a syntactical inversion is the places in the poem where the poet has changed the normal places of words in order to conform to their rhyme scheme or better convey their meaning in terms of emphasis. Allow me to put on my reading glasses. And we have syntactical inversions here because this would normally be phrased, that terrible pageant. Happens again here where it says, my soul in pity flings. Normal English would be something like, in pity my soul flings, appealing cries. Same thing with why dream I here beneath my homely thatch. Now, taken individually, these syntactical inversions might not seem like a big deal, but when you're considering syntactical inversions combined with figurative language and vocabulary words that you don't know the meanings of, it all kinds of adds up and can make the meaning of the poem kind of blurry to you. Of course, figurative language is any language meant to be taken literally. A person's head is not literally weighed down. This part about fiercely pouring fire and waste in fields, literal, World War I. Writhing grotesque things, literal, World War I. Probably bodies. My soul in pity flings. Probably figurative language because the soul can't really fling something. Anyway, you get the idea. Now that you've annotated for these items, take a second to look up vocabulary words that you don't know the meanings of, to reorder your syntactical inversions, and think about the meanings of figurative language. After you've done that, paraphrase the poem. That means put it in your own words. Again, some music for you. Thank you for paraphrasing. I'm going to go ahead and show you my paraphrase, just so you see how it matches up with yours. So you can see here, in comparing my paraphrase to the original poem, how much easier it is to understand the poem now that I've gone through these steps of annotating and doing some work to comprehend some of the more complex features of the poem. You could probably also see how much work it is. Many times my students ask me if they have to annotate the whole poem, if they have to paraphrase line by line, and I ask them how many poems I assigned them that night. Usually I've only assigned them one poem. When your teacher assigns you a poem, they're probably assuming you're going to spend a great deal of time on it because they only assigned you one poem, not 20 pages of prose. Now that I've paraphrased the poem, I can see that this is a poem from the point of view of a woman sitting and sewing. She's thinking about World War I. She is thinking about all the dangers that are imperiling all the men out there on that battlefield. And she's thinking about how, even though it's obviously quite terrible, she still wishes she could be there because she finds sitting and sewing to feel useless. And she thinks that if she were out there, she could really help and make a big difference in the world. This is basically what is happening in the poem on a literal level. And once we've understood this, now we're ready to move on to step 3 and analyze the poem. When we analyze something, we break it down into smaller parts and we try to start to see patterns. I'm going to ask you to annotate again, but I'm going to ask you to look for patterns. Look for repeated phrases, look for words that might have more than one meaning, and finally, I'm going to ask you to look for the shift. Now, depending on the poem you're reading, a poem might have multiple shifts. A shift is a change in tone, perspective, or subject matter. It's crucial to see the shift in order to understand a poem's thematic meaning. It's a pivotal moment that adds depth and complexity to the poem. And the shift we're looking for here is the key shift that usually happens near the end of the poem. So as you're annotating this second time around, look for the shift. You can look for changes in tone, but you can also look for some common signals, such as transition words like but, yet, and although, changes in punctuation, or changes in perspective. Do 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 do. All right, welcome back. I know you've annotated yourself, but let me show you a couple things I'm going to annotate so we can compare. One of the main things I notice in this poem when I annotate is the repetition and the double meanings of words. Here in the beginning, it's a useless task. Here at the end, it's a useless task. We have the word seem here. We have the word seem here. They're spelled differently, but because they're both occurring in the same place with the same sound, and if a poet read these, there would be no visible distinction, I'm going to assume there's some kind of blur between the two meanings of these words. I'm noticing a capitalization here of the word death, which implies that this person is thinking of death as like a larger thing, almost like a personified, like the great death that faces us all as humans. I'm also going to all these repetitions here. Again, the word seem. I'm probably missing some instances of the word seem here. I'm looking here at the end to see if I can find a shift. And I'm going to go ahead and think that I'm going to locate it here. There's a couple of different reasons for doing this. One is because here we're ending with a question mark, and here we have an answer by the poet. So there is one signal in terms of punctuation. There's also a change in tone here because throughout most of the poem, the poet has been thinking to herself. This is the first time that the poet speaks out and directly addresses someone, in this case, God. There's also an exclamation point here for the first time, yet another signal. And I'm thinking this is a crucial moment in the poem because this is the first place that the poet becomes assertive and speaks out. In fact, by the end of the poem, this poet is now asking a question, whether or not they really have to sit and sew. For most of the poem, they simply accepted that they had to sit and sew. So now I can start to see the poem a little differently. I can almost see it as a journey of a woman. I can think of this almost in terms of a plot diagram, with the climax of the poem happening in the shift. I can think of the poem as kind of a journey here, spiritually and intellectually, for this woman, where she's reflecting on her society and the way it confines her as a woman, yet still accepting it during this time of war, to one where, by the end, she asserts that the world needs her, and implicitly then needs all women. But in typical fashion, probably for a woman writing in 1918, when it was still difficult for women to speak directly, this poet is still a step back from asserting that a woman could fight just as well on a battlefield as a man. This woman is still not yet ready to say that men and women should have all the same rights. Instead, she is at least openly questioning her society and wondering whether society must restrict women. So just to review, in analyzing this poem, we followed three basic steps. One is thinking about the title, the speaker in the historical context. The second was reading the poem, annotating it, and comprehending it on a basic level. The third step was to look for patterns in terms of repetition, words with double meanings, and figurative language in order to comprehend a deeper thematic concept and a thematic statement. I've walked you through this poem and helped you put it all together at the end so you can see Dunbar's basic message about feminism. At the same time, I hope that annotating together has helped you appreciate poetry on a basic aesthetic level. It's pretty cool the way this poet uses multiple word meanings and figurative language in order to convey their meaning. And I hope that you can take these concepts and apply them to all the other poems you read. You could analyze a poem in a lot more steps, in a lot more detail, but this at least should get you started. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. Thanks for watching Zubify. Subscribe for more lessons on writing and literature.